Welcome back to Government 148. In this session, we're going to talk about Lebanon, the politics and government of Lebanon. Greater Lebanon was a French creation around 1920. Under the Ottoman empires, there was an autonomous district of Mount Lebanon, not comprising the whole country as it is today. Around 1914, at the time of World War I, the population of that area was roughly about 400,000. 4/5 of that population were Christians, and about a fifth were Muslims. The French idea was to take the largest group with whom they had close ties. These were the Maronites, and create a gerrymandering around them. After World War I, about 55% were Christian in the area, and of the 55%, about a third were Maronite Christians, and therefore the Maronites were still the single largest community in all of Lebanon. At that time also, it's important to note that the Shiites, the Muslim sect Shiites, were about 17% of the population. This is now again circa 1921 at the end of World War I. So what I want to do is begin with giving you a demographic picture of the various sects, because in the case of Lebanon, this happens to be a critical factor in terms of the kind of nation state Lebanon is and the kind of vulnerability Lebanon has in terms of sectarian conflict. So we will begin with the demographic picture. The demographic picture, I'm going to begin with the Maronites, the Sunni Muslims, the Shiites, the Christian Orthodox, the Druze. The Druze, if you recall, I mentioned they're the offshoot of Islam, but they have drifted pretty far away. The Malkites, these are the Eastern Rite Chalcedonian group of Christians in the area, and then the Armenians, and of course the Jews. So after World War I, if we were to rank them ordinally in terms of the size, the ranking would look like this, with the largest number being the Maronites and the smallest number being the Jews. In 1932, there was a census that showed roughly about 51% of Lebanon's population were Christians and about 49% were Muslim, all sects. And so in 1952, this was the breakdown, again, with the Maronites comprising the largest, 29%, and after the Armenian, I put everybody in the category of others with around 5%. Interestingly, and really for a really pragmatic reason, after 1932, Lebanon stopped taking official population census. The reason for that was obvious. The Maronites were in control, and they knew that the demographic trend worked against them, because the birth rate in the Muslim population was faster, and the Muslims were catching up very quickly. So they knew that in a very short order, the Christian will no longer be the majority. Today, of course, the Muslims comprise the largest population, some 70% of it. So if you look at the rank orders today, you will see the following changes. Maronite have shifted from the first position to the third position. The Sunnis are still in the second position, but the most dramatic change have been on the part of the Shiites. They're now a clear plurality in Lebanon. They're the largest group. So you can see this switch of position between the Maronites and the Shiite Muslims, with the Shiites being the largest sect in Lebanon, and Maronite dropping down to the third position. The remaining positions are the same, no change in terms of order, rank order. As I also mentioned today, this picture is very different than when in 1932, when the census was taken, the first really good data we have. Muslims roughly comprise 70% of the population, and among the Muslims, Shiites are clearly in plurality. Christians now comprise about 25%, and Druze and the rest of the sects comprise about 7% of the population. And now that the Muslims are a clear majority, the challenge for Lebanon is that the majority wants to be treated as such. They want to have that power that goes with size. But of course, one of the saga of Lebanon, one of the tragedies of Lebanon is the unwillingness of the Maronites to give up their politically privileged positions and power, and they're doing it with extreme reluctance. And of course, this is a pattern, almost a universal pattern. People are unwilling to give up power. They're reluctant to do that. Nations are reluctant or very grudgingly give up their preeminence, even though they no longer can even afford it. So this has been at the root of the conflict that we see in Lebanon, this sectarian changes in power that has taken place and the reluctance of the losing group to accept changes that would demote their position in the society. Now, for the French, as I mentioned, the French occupied, in the previous lecture we talked about that, took over as mandate that area, including Syria. And for the French, really it was their social elites that had emotional ties to Lebanon. These elites really had a kind of a love affair with the Maronites. And otherwise, if you exclude the Maronites, I mean, they understand a lot about Maronites politics and Maronite group, but otherwise the French really don't understand Lebanon very well, and in some ways are blinded by their strong attachment to one sect, the Maronites. So, for example, if you really want to understand French's policy toward Israel, you can pretty much predict it in terms of whether or not the Maronites are in alliance with Israel or not. And they usually are. And if that happens, you can guess that the French will usually support the Israelis' policy. And in fact, just as an aside, I should add that it was the French assistant in the 1960s that was so crucial in terms of enabling the Israelis to develop their nuclear weapons. Americans really were worried about this, and we kept giving them all kinds of incentives during the Kennedy era and even Johnson's era so that they would not develop their nuclear weapon. It was the French that were giving them the help to develop it. So based on the picture that I have tried to present to you in terms of the demographic makeup of Lebanon, you can see that in Lebanon there is strong attachment to clans and to sect, and this should come out pretty clearly. So given that situation, the first conclusion or the first major point that I want to draw your attention to is that Lebanon is not a nation state in the sense, for example, that some of the countries in Europe, in Western Europe, are, in the sense that French is, in the sense that Spain is, in a sense that Britain is, or in a sense that the United States is, although the United States is in a different category of nation state than, let's say, French. And it's not a nation state because there has been a persistence of patrimonial system for a long, long period in Lebanon. Way beyond, in fact, of what would be expected because of the forces of change should erode those patrimonial attachment. So in other words, in Lebanon, the change process has not gone in the direction of nationalism as it had in other societies. And I'm emphasizing that because this is a kind of a prelude to my explanation of the kind of civil wars that we're going to have in Lebanon. And I'm suggesting that this sectarian divide and the persistence of sectarian identities have had played a very important role. It's an important element in the conflict and in the understanding of the roots of the conflict in Lebanon. In 1943, the French granted independence to Lebanon, but before doing so, they worked out what was a national pact. It's an unwritten pact, and the pact was to ensure the domination of the Maronite Christians over the Lebanese politics and ruling over the other sect. This was done through what is called a confessional system in which there was a formula for gerrymandering of the Lebanese territory on the basis of sect, and most importantly, a gerrymandering of Lebanese state power in terms of the sects to ensure the domination of the Maronites. So in terms of this pact, the president of Lebanon and the commander-in-chief in Lebanon and high bureaucratic positions will always be Maronites. The prime minister will be a Sunni because they were the second largest group. And finally, the Shiites will be always, without exception, the Speaker of the Parliament or the Chamber of Deputies. Other sects are to be represented in the cabinet, and these in the early days were about 8 or 10 because the cabinet positions were smaller. Today it's much larger. So they all get some representation in the cabinet. So you get 2 or 3 Maronite minister, 2 or 3 Sunni minister, one each from the Greeks, Orthodox, and the Catholics, and Shiites, and Druze, and so forth. So they had created this confessional system on the basis of which power sharing, although the sharing was really very much in favor of one group, the Maronite, as opposed to the other group. So we have that situation, and in the case of the parliament, the representation of the people of Lebanon in the parliament or the Chamber of Deputies was also apportioned on the basis of sects. So that meant you would get 6 Christian to 5 Muslims. And then from there on, the number of deputies, if you were going to change that, it would always have to be a multiple of 11, 5 plus 6, to ensure that the permanence of that ratio. So you can imagine that by the 1970s, these numbers and these type of divisions were way off the demographic reality into which Lebanon had evolved. So in Lebanon, we have one of the best examples of the phenomena that I discussed very early in this course, and that was the phenomena of a non-nation state. In other words, when you look at Lebanon, you're looking at a non-nation state. you're looking at identities that have not been transcended with one encompassing identity that everyone will share. So for example, in the United States, if you recall, I mentioned that we have different races, different religions, and different sects. And they all are competing. Oftentimes we don't like each other's races or religions or sect, and sometimes we're very intolerant toward them. Nonetheless, there has emerged, especially after the Civil War in this country, one encompassing identity that in a sense trumps most of these other identities, and that is we are all Americans. This sense of we are all Lebanese have never truly developed in Lebanon. And therefore, a Maronite, first and foremost, is a Maronite Christian, and Maronite does not necessarily has any strong attachment to other Christians, even though they're all Christians. So the Orthodox and Maronite can be fighting each other. Even within the Maronites, there are divisions of sects. Division of clans. One clan can murder the other clan, as they have. So in Lebanon, you have this very interesting mix of traditional identity, clan-based, even smaller than sects, as well as modern identity. And so this amalgamation of the traditional and modern, in many sense, makes the identity picture in Lebanon very unique. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that when you look at this identity picture, the idea of Lebanon as an encompassing identity is impossible. No, not at all. I'm suggesting that in fact you may be able to transcend this under right circumstances. So you will see that I'm going to be, in the next lectures, I'm going to be discussing the first Civil War, 1957-1958. And then there is a nice, wonderful interlude from 1958 to roughly around 1975. During that interlude, in fact, the notion of one encompassing identity, somewhat transcending the other competing identities, the identity of being a Lebanese, was on the verge, on the cusp of developing. And then suddenly in 1975, you get the Great Civil War that destroys that. And so since then, Lebanese are trying to create that one encompassing identity so that they could become a nation state. But it's at best a work in progress.